Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our second exciting day, which will be as rich as yesterday, so lots of things to come. It is, as always, a great joy and privilege to have Father Professor Andrew Louth with us as one of the keynote speakers for this conference. Father Andrew is very well known in the Orthodox world, particularly in academic circles, so he hardly needs an introduction. I will therefore be brief. Father Andrew was Professor of Patristic and Byzantine Studies at Durham University. He had taught before at Oxford University and the University of London. Father Andrew is also currently a visiting professor of our institute here in Cambridge. He has in fact been one of the important mentors and friends of IOCS ever since the early days of the institute, and he has often lectured for us in these past nearly 2 decades. His main interests are the history of theology in the Greek tradition in the period of the Byzantine Empire between the 5th and the 15th centuries, but also later in the modern period, the 19th century and later, where his research interests also include Russian and Romanian theology. More widely, he has been interested in Byzantine art, iconography, ceremonial Byzantine theology, Orthodox theology, and spirituality. Father Andrew has published numerous books and studies on all of these themes, too many to mention. They have appeared in many translations all over the world. Indeed, Father Andrew is certainly one of the greatest and most popular Orthodox scholars and authors today, worldwide. So we are very fortunate to have him with us for our conference. He will speak today on the icon and the beginnings of modernism in the arts. Father Andrew, over to you.
Thank you very much. It's very kind. Part of what you said was drawn from the website thing in Durham, which is about 8 years out of date at least, and I ought to do something about it, but I have no idea how. I mean, it gives the impression I'm interested in Russian and Romanian Orthodox theology, not, for instance, Greek or Serbian theology, which is not true. The other thing, some years ago, I went to a conference in Ireland, and Father Vincent Toomey, a rather splendid Catholic priest, turned up with a great pile of books, and he put them down. He said, "Now, if the lecturer comes with a great pile of books, you can be sure he hasn't prepared it properly." Now, I would have done that today, except that I have to carry them all down from Durham, so I haven't got a great pile of books, but it's still in a very similar state of unpreparedness. It really consists of really of three parts. Two of which revolve around a particular person, and then the last of which is a kind of an appendix which carries on from where I hope we've got at the end of the second person. Let's just start with a quotation. "We have forgotten, or perhaps better translated, unlearnt, the language of the hieroglyphs. Their key is lost to us. The language of God is the highest concept, and we can no longer conceive it. How then shall we be able to think? Its supernatural compass operates within the heart. We have forgotten how to think with the heart, let alone with the head. We can no longer imagine the excitement that the sight of such as Simeon the Stylite exercised over his contemporaries. We seek to introduce another morality, but there is only one morality, that of the heart and its victory. And there is only one morality, only one meaning of human existence, the elucidation of the divine signs through the human heart. How have we failed to recognize this? We seek to draw Lot's guests out of their hiddenness in order to drag them in the gutter. And the angels are no longer enough for us. We want archangels. And so we end up under heavens that are bursting with blood and fire. And so we find ourselves thrown before the desert of bones, like Ezekiel. For the Lord led him there. Only we don't believe it. That's the beginning of of the third section of a book called Byzantinisches Christentum, which was written by a person who was the subject of the first part of this, a German writer called Eugenio Ball. Now, Eugenio Ball is mostly this book, Byzantinisches Christentum. He wrote shortly before he died. It was published in 1923, and he died in 1927. That quotation is the beginning of the third part. It consists of three parts. Byzantinisches Christentum. The central part, long, is on Dionysius the Areopagite. The first part is on John Climacus, and the last part is on Simeon the Stylite. Might seem a strange sort of combination. And the last part on Simeon begins with this very striking quotation, very striking passage I've just quoted. It expresses a sense of meaninglessness, a sense that we have no longer, we've lost our oarings completely. We don't even know what it is that we want to find out in order to understand anything at all. There's complete inability, human inability, to make any sense of God, and indeed of the world. And along with this, a sense that this is that a sense of lostness, a sense that we've lost what we need, not that we've never known it, but that we've lost it. It expressed very much the feeling of the times. So 1923, after the First World War and the devastation that it had led to, and not just the devastation in terms of human lives, but the complete sort of rewriting of the political landscape. The Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Ottoman Empire collapsed as a result. So did the Russian Empire, to be replaced by the Soviet Union. There was a state of complete sort of unrootedness. And the year before, 1922, saw the publication of both James Joyce's Ulysses and T.S. Eliot's The Waste Land, which for English-speaking people, at any rate, are two emblems of modernism. It was also the year of the completion of Paul Florensky's Iconostas, though it was not published until many years later in the 1960s. And we'll come back to that in a minute. But before we go a step further, it just struck me when I was looking through this yesterday that there's something peculiarly appropriate about talking about Simeon Stylites today, which is the feast of Simeon Stylites, the beginning of the church year, the beginning of the 12th indiction. That's how I calculate it to be. So who was Eugenio Ball? He was born in 1866. He died in 1927, as I said. He is a central figure in German culture at the turn of the century, and the founder of what was called the Dada movement. He was extraordinarily prolific in all sorts of ways. He was a writer, a controversialist, a poet. He was involved in theatrical things, and he was involved in sort of most things in some way or another. But from the point of view, from our point of view, his main work is from the last decade of his life, and this is this book, Byzantinisches Christentum, which I'll come back to, and which was written, I say, in the last part of his life after he had returned to his the Catholicism into which he'd been born. Now, why begin with him? Well, one sort of reason is that he has a curiously, though he's a Catholic, the Catholicism that he returned to was not exactly the Catholicism of his day, as it were. He really returned, for him, Byzantium was the beacon of the faith that he came back to. And Byzantinisches Christentum is a very remarkable take on what Christianity meant in the Byzantine world. But he also has a curious sort of a kind of walk-in part, if you like, in the intellectual history of of modern orthodoxy. In that he was an influence on Nikifor Kreinik, who heard about him, went to see him in Switzerland, I think it must have been, in Zurich, and went to find out about these radical movements in the arts, and met Hugo Ball, got to know him quite well, I gather, and learnt from Hugo Ball not about Dadaism and all that, but about Byzantine Christianity, his own tradition. And he returned to Romania, became a theologian, teaching initially at Chisinau University and then in Bucharest. And the chair he held was the chair that, after the Second World War, Father Demetrius Staniloae held in Bucharest. Now, when I was trying to, but more to the point, in trying to think my way into this lecture, and I say this is all very tentative, partly because it was done too quickly, and partly because it was done too slowly, because it's something that's been occupying me for a very long time, which I suppose you could say represents a further stab at things that I've been trying to do for quite a long time. When I was in Amsterdam, in the visiting professor there a few years ago, I gave a course of lectures over 2 years, which resulted in my book Modern Orthodox Thinkers. And when I finished it, I was aware that there were all sorts of bits that needed sorting out, and one of them was the question of the icon and the recovery of the icon. And about 3 years ago, I was invited to give the Zernoff lecture, and I gave it with the title "The Recovery of the Icon." And various sort of things that itself was not only extraordinarily interesting, but it also meant it was a kind of gathering together of all sorts of themes that I'd not been able to address directly in my book Modern Orthodox Thinkers, and it also It led me into another sort of area of study that I go to art galleries, and I'm very interested in the arts. I've got a huge collection of catalogues, which has proved very, very useful in the work that I've been trying to do. But the thing that is occupying me and gave the title of the lecture, I think the title perhaps would be better, Orthodoxy and the Beginnings of Modernism, rather than the icon, is the way in which there are parallels with the recovered appreciation of the icon and the appreciation of modernism in the arts. And this is a kind of historical phenomenon. There are three figures, Russians, collectors, wealthy men, collectors, who seem to have been interested both in icons and also in modernism. The three figures are Tretyakov, whose icon collection forms the heart of whose art collection, which includes icons, forms the heart of the Tretyakov Gallery in Moscow, and then two others, Morozov and Shchukin. All of them are said to have come from Old Believer families, which I think is probably true, but there's no real evidence that any of them themselves were Old Believers. And in some writings that have been made recently, a great deal has been made of the fact that somebody like Shchukin, an Old Believer, as many people believed, in some ways it suggested that his eyes were opened to modernism because of his appreciation of ancient icons. He certainly had ancient icons in his collection. They're nothing like as many as Tretyakov. And indeed, it's sometimes said, and there may be some truth in this, that the picture there, which was commissioned by Shchukin from Matisse, the dance, is modelled in some kind of way on that. The Trinity icon of Rublev. It's not a very good picture, but I took it. All of these pictures were taken yesterday morning in a rather sort of hastily, And that's you've got a bit of my icon corner, but forget about that. That's the icon is the central thing. The link, of course, is partly that the three figures in Rublev Trinity icon are enclosed in a circle, or can be seen as enclosed in a circle, and this circle is the circle of the dance that is there in Matisse's The Dance. How convincing this is, I don't know, but it certainly is the case that in his own home, Shukeen displayed his pictures as if it was a great, huge iconostasis, and this was right at the top. There was an exhibition in Paris 2-3 years ago called the Shukeen Collection, and there are lots of, apart from having lots of pictures of the, displaying many of the of Shukeen's acquisitions, both modern art, other sorts of art, and icons a bit. Also, there are pictures of his house in Paris and the way that they were originally sort of seen. And various articles recently in Sobornos by people like Charles Locke and also Clemena Antonova have been exploring the way in which the icon has got links with modernism in the arts. One thing in particular, of course, is the use of what's called reversed perspective in icons, and the way in which Florensky developed around this a whole justification of the icon in contrast to Western art from the Renaissance onwards. But as in many cases, the more I read, the less clear I get about what can be claimed. I mean, the link with the old believers may be true, but it partly it's emphasised in such a way because it seems to be thought that the old believers were a very, very small minority in Russia. Well, at the beginning of the 20th century, there were 20% of great Russians were old believers, so by no means a tiny minority of figures. And if you add to that people who belonged to old believers' families and weren't old believers, it was probably not all that remarkable. And anyway, the story of the rediscovery of the icons is not really all that closely bound up with old believers either. Let's go back to Hugo Ball, because we'll come back to all that later, sort of. Dadaism was a movement that challenged the form and the value of the arts, both visual, theatrical, and prophetic. It was a kind of, well, it kind of recurred, if you like, in the theatre of the absurd in England in the late 50s and 60s. It's a rationalist. It welcomed in the second and third decades of the 20th century, welcomed the way in which burgeoning psychoanalysis reduced apparently rational human behaviour to unconscious urges and undermined traditional ways of understanding human behaviour, undermined traditional ways of behaving. Dada itself was, well, there are various. Dada itself was basically meaningless. It's sometimes said that Hugo Ball sort of picked it out of a dictionary, sometimes, but I'm not so sure. It was a kind of meaningless incantation, which was elusive of lots of meanings, but contained really no meaning itself. The first Dadaist manifesto was written by Ball, and it starts off like this. Dada is a new direction for the arts. One can perhaps recognise that up to now no one had ever heard of it, and tomorrow the whole of Zurich will be talking of nothing else. It is dreadfully simple. In French, it means a hobby horse. In German, it means adio, get up and on my back. Goodbye, again. In Romanian, yes, truly, you're right, it is so. No, dada, dada, dada. and so on. It's an intentional word, only a word, and the word as movement. Very easy to understand. It is quite dreadfully simple, and so on. And then it descends into a kind of incantation of Dada attached to one thing after another. And ends by saying each thing has its word, but the word has become a thing in itself. Why should we not find it? Why can't a tree be called pluplash, or rather pluplupash, for that matter? The word. Outside your sphere, your strictly your stuffy comfort zone, this ridiculous importance, your stupendous self-satisfaction, outside this repetition, your obvious dimness, the word. Ladies and gentlemen, the word is a public opportunity of the first rank. It actually reads a lot better in German, but that is the beginning and the end of this first Dadaist manifesto. It's written in a kind of incantatory way, and it's not surprising that one of his friends, Hans Vogt-Wiebel, composed a litany to Saint Ball, which includes this bit. You homely fame, you migrating dilettante, you eternist without a task, you who have raised resistance to the highest human right, you who have sought your whole life long for a new concept for the norm of old men, you who have suffered the German mentality as the loss of instinctive morality, you who have in all conditions of life conferred an unheard sound, you believing rebel, you Dadaist penitent, you laughing heretic, you king of letters. 5 years later, though, he would confide to his diary that the word Dada encountered me as if I'd twice called on Dionysius Areopagita, Dionysius Areopagita. Da. And so from the meaninglessness of Dada, Ball came to discover how can I put it? Came to discover a kind of calling upon Dionysius the Areopagite. And surely part of the reason for this, or some of the reason for this, is because in this Dionysius he finds an apophatic calling on God, contradicting the cataphatic calling on God. They're both there in Dionysius. He's not just an apophaticist. The apophatic and the cataphatic are held together in complete contradiction. But a contradiction that is maybe apparent nonsense, but turns into a kind of mystical, metaphysical knowledge. And I said, Dionysius is the central part of his book, Byzantine Issues Christendom, a section of nearly 200 pages, flanked by chapters on Climacus and Simeon the Stylite. So Dionysius is placed, as it were, in a triptych between two great ascetics, John of the Ladder and Simeon the Stylite. But Dionysius himself is not an ascetic, nor does Ball regard him so. Rather, as Kurt Flasch says in his article in a symposium on Hugo Ball called Dionysius Dada Areopagita, Hugo Ball und die Kritik der Moderne, Ball, he says, sees him, that is Dionysius, as a philosopher of the priesthood. But it is a priesthood founded on enlightenment and kindly self-communication, not a power and organisation. Which seems to me a statement full of insight about Dionysius himself. And this I give you to start off with as an example of the newness of the old, the newness of the ancient Byzantine Christianity, a Christianity expressed particularly by Dionysius the Areopagite. Dada for Ball meant Oh dear, I wish I could read my writing sometimes. I didn't write it. For Ball, Dada had the distinction of being a way of undermining what it was to understand, that, as it were, bottomed out into a grasp of what it was to understand, that was old and yet new. So, Dada, as Danisse Revita twice, found this nonsense turned into the wisdom that lay at the heart of Byzantine Christianity. A wisdom that Ball goes on to emphasize is founded by, or at least flanked by, rigorous asceticism. Flash, interestingly, compares Ball's treatment of step 5 of the ladder, which is the bulk of what he has to, the bulk of what he talks about. Step 5 of the ladder, that is the chapter on repentance, which contains, we'll remember, and mainly consists of a terrifying account of what he calls the prison, where monks were sent to sober up and become proper monks. And he compares this terrifying account of the way they were humiliated in the prison with Kafka's short story Strafkolonie, in the penal colony, which was published in 1919. So very likely something that Ball had read around about the time that he was writing his book. And so these rigorous ascetics, as it were, frame the core of what he took Byzantine Christianity to be, and this is something that this one is. Where have we got? Sorry. This was the Christianity to which he returned, having sort of, as it were, sort of come back to Christianity through the exploration of nonsense, really, via what he called Dada. But the icon. I think the way in here is through the greatest exponent of abstraction in the arts, Vasily Kandinsky. I'd like to know a lot more about his life and the life of the people he knew. A lot that's asserted I've seen asserted is very difficult to justify. There are links, it seems to be, between Kandinsky and Florensky and Sergei Bulgakov. Somebody who was working on this once told me that Bulgakov and Kandinsky were related, even brothers-in-law, but I can't see how it possibly could be true. I mean, not if my brother-in-law, you mean the husband of your sister. I can't see how it could possibly work like that. Nevertheless, they knew one another, though the evidence suggests that they didn't know one another very well. When Kandinsky was preparing his so-called Der Blau-Reiter Almanach, a book with illustrations and letters and a lot of articles, he asked Bulgakov to contribute, and he didn't. But he didn't ask him directly. He asked him through a friend, which suggests to me that he didn't know him very well, but certainly knew of him and had some sort of interest in him. But I find it very difficult to push it any further. There were religious influences, certainly, on Kandinsky, and we'll come back across some of them in a moment. And it's quite likely that he knew Father Pavel Florensky, who was well known in intellectual circles in Moscow in the second decade of the 20th century. But it's difficult to find any clear evidence, and I've looked very hard and not been very successful. But the importance of Kandinsky is partly that he certainly has some sorts of links with the some sorts of links with the Orthodox tradition, some sort of links with icons of it. But I think he had much stronger links with the occultist movements that were just as strong in Russia as they were anywhere else at the beginning of the 20th century. I mean, he was, for instance, on the spiritual in art, the shorter, the first and shorter statement of how you get to abstraction or why abstraction is necessary. In that he refers to Madame Blavatsky, he refers to Maeterlinck. We're in a world we're very familiar with, but it's not the world of Orthodox Christianity. Now we all know that late 19th, early 20th centuries saw a crisis in Western art. And in some ways I think it must have been provoked by photography, because once you have photography, you can produce accurately and simply what was the ideal of art from the Renaissance onwards. A view as through a window from a perspective of one unmoving eye. Florensky, in his several of his works, makes great fun of the way in which this is a complete, not only illusion, but delusion. We don't normally look at the world with one eye, from one perspective, and to think of it like that, as Renaissance paintings do, with a very precise one point to which all parallel lines are sort of going, to create a sense of depth. This is actually a travesty of the way human beings actually look, because human beings have got two eyes as a rule, and what we see is composed, not just of what we see, but of what we think we know. It's not just registered as with the camera, and also it's not insignificant that in the period in the 17th and the 18th century, a camera oscura was often used as a way of achieving a more accurate kind of perspective. It's a kind of mechanical thing, which Florensky attacks in a very coruscating way. We could go on about Florensky, but we'll never get to the end if we do that. The first reaction, in some ways, is Impressionism, which does two things. One is that it wants to paint what is just there, and there are all these stories about, but they went out into the open air and painted what was there, and didn't go back then and sort of tidy it up and produce a kind of salon painting. But it was just an attempt to record what was there, and people like Monet spent hours and hours and hours recording just what was there, at different times of day, at different perspectives, and different times of the year, and so on. But secondly, what is there is colour. That Impressionist paintings consist of colour, and they don't really use line. Line is said to be implied by the edge of the colour, and that was a kind of theory of what it is that we see. And then you begin to get sort of other attempts to analyse, if you like, what it is that we see. I was going to have some pictures, but we can get there in time. Cézanne, for instance, analyses what he sees into slabs, into shapes that are actually there, but he emphasises the fact that, when you're looking at something, you're looking at a collection of shapes that are of different colours, and he brings out that aspect rather than just as we're painting what we think we see. And when you do that, you're well on the way to Cubism and allied ways of seeing. But beneath all this, there's a question, a very simple question that's being asked, which is, what is art? What is a painting? What is it if it isn't a depiction? And what is a picture if it isn't a depiction of something? What's the essence of what really is art? And to take I'm going to take you by a slightly have a detour, which I hope will help a bit. David Jones, the famous Anglo-Welsh artist and poet, in his famous essay *Art and the Sacrament*, recalls the discussions that he says used to take place among the students, of whom he was one, in Camberwell College of Arts in the 20s when he was studying. And at one point he talks about what he calls the post-impressionist theory of art, and he says that this may not be true, may not be fashionable any longer, but however that may be, there is implicit in post-impressionist theory something which, being true, must remain true and cannot be gainsaid. It was that something which opened the eyes, it was that something which opened the eyes of us to what, many years back, I had occasion to describe as the unity of all made things. For one of the more rewarding notions implicit in the post-impressionist idea was that a work is a thing, and not necessarily the impression of some other thing. For example, it is the abstract, in inverted commas, quality in any painting, however realistic, that causes that painting to have being, and which alone gives it the right to be claimed as an artwork, as a making, as pieces. And then he gives a series of examples of what he means. The triple spiral in the New Grange caves. Palestrina's music for the Improperia. The columns of the Parthenon. The arranged disorders of Julia's love knots. The taut hemp knot for a tackle. Any liturgical act. The thatching of a roof. Now, David Jones might seem a strange way into modernism, certainly into abstract art, which he never, as far as I know, ever attempted. But what he says is just such an introduction. Even though his art is pretty well unclassable in itself, nevertheless his great poems, in parenthesis and anathemata, must be regarded as monuments of later monuments of modernism in literature, English literature. Now, how did the icon come in here? There are several things that we need to sort of realise. The first is that though the icon is an ancient form of Christian art, at the end of the 19th, the beginning of the 20th century, the icon was being rediscovered, that it had been more or less lost. Icons in churches were dark and covered with soot and wax. And it was only in the 19th century that people began to realise, partly because of the work of scholars, that this isn't what the icons were meant to be like, and attempts to clean icons began to be employed in Russia in the last few decades of the 19th century. Initially rather crude and rather destructive ways of cleaning. But by the I think it's in 1909 there was an exhibition of ancient icons in Moscow. I think Moscow, which revealed the colour of the icons. And one of the works that talked about this is called in Russian. It's called Meditation in Colour by Eugenio Ball. So the cleansed icon was seen as composed of colour. It's not depicting anything in any ordinary sense of the word. What is depicted is stylized in various ways. And both the dramatic colour and the lack of any normal kind of depiction undermined any attempt to see it in terms of Renaissance art, to see it as depiction. The abandonment of linear perspective, that have been because of the abandonment of linear perspective that have been unchallenged since the Renaissance. And all of this is brought out in Florensky's marvellous writings, few of which were published until the 60s and even later. So the icon not intended to depict by creating an illusion, or a delusion, as Florensky would have put it, but really rather intended to create an encounter, to draw one into the icon, to enable one to enter into it, to commune with it in some way. And once you talk of it in those terms, you find that what you're doing is using exactly the same kind of language that Kandinsky is going to use in his theoretical works on art, particularly on the spiritual in art, which was the earlier of his two major works. In what I say, very briefly, because I've not got much time, but in what I'm going to say briefly about Kandinsky, I've been guided by two books. One by the great philosopher Michel Henry, called Voir l'invisible sur Kandinsky, and another by a woman called Olga Medvedkova, about whom I know very little except her works. And one of her works, rather beautifully and strangely produced, is called Kandinsky, Le peintre de l'invisible. It's interesting they both want to talk in terms of what Kandinsky is doing, is seeing the invisible. Voir l'invisible, as Michel Henry puts it. And Henry, as he explains Kandinsky, and it's a very close exposition of what Kandinsky himself says, so I trust it, is that what Kandinsky is wanting to do is to say that art is not about the exterior, it's not about what's outside, it is about something that you're led into by the painting. The sort of language I just used, the icon. And in particular he wants to talk about interiority, the invisible, so that we can see, as it were, through the picture without being distracted by surface reality, the external, the visible. And Michel Henry draws attention to what he calls the Kandinskian equation. Interior equals interiority equals invisible equals life equals pathos equals the abstract. Now, this now turns into a slideshow because it's easy to see these things and look at them. That's a painting which is actually called Colourful Life by Kandinsky, quite an early work, which, what would you call it? I think magical realism is what I'd call it, which is very, very, very one of the things that comes out of the end of the 19th century. The if you like, the patron saint of this sort of art is the unschooled painter, Douanier Rousseau, and a lot of people, Gauguin, Van Gogh, as I now have been instructed to pronounce them, they see this, and their way sort of out from the Renaissance is through this kind of magical realism. In Van Gogh, it very often amounts to seeing life in what we would say inanimate things, rather than seeing life in human things. And in some ways too, the use of colour is also reminiscent, I think, of the kind of colour in the icons that was being rediscovered about the same time. Then my next one is his attempt at an icon. I didn't know about these until very recently. There are a whole collection of things that are in some ways his attempt at an icon. This is called Resurrection. And if you look at it, try to analyse what's there. It's a very bad picture, I'm afraid. I said doing very quickly. The camera wanted to. The flash worked, and it's rather messed it up. But what he seems to me he's doing is deconstructing the symbols that go with the resurrection, in particular the trumpet of the last trump that heralds the resurrection of the dead, the departed, and then, as it were, not depicting, but as it were, trying to draw you into what the resurrection might mean. Another example. This isn't Kandinsky. This is a quite late Russian icon of St. George, and this is one of the sketches that Kandinsky did for the Blaue Reiter Almanac. It didn't appear in it, but it's clearly based on the icon. It takes the frame of the icon, the themes of the icon, the shapes that surround it, and then turns, and George becomes der Blaue Reiter. Now, actually, I took some other pictures, and for some mysterious reason, didn't put them in. So we have to leave it there for the moment. I got some pictures. One of the people the Russians, who I think does respond to the recovery of the icon in terms of modernism, is the painter Goncharova. And there, I think there are very clear parallels that could be drawn. But as I said, I did take pictures, but they didn't seem. I'm not quite sure what happened. Now we come to the appendix. Which is this: what might an abstract icon look like? Does it make sense to think in these terms? Is it a route that is at all worth pursuing? And I want to start not in the 20th century, but in the 6th century. And it's something that I think I would never really have understood, never grasped, except for the work of a friend of mine who is an icon painter, as well as being an art historian, and interested in philosophy of art as well. A chap called Uroš Todorović, Serbian. It's kind of Serbian Greek. He lives in Athens now. This is from Hagia Sophia. And the two figures, the two panels rather, are both the same kind of thing. Now, until Uroš pointed this out to me, I'd been to Hagia Sophia once or twice, but never really noticed what they are. What they are is a block of marble has been taken, it's been split and then polished and then put together. What you've got is what you've got is terrible, really. I'm sorry. Down here is where it's fitted together, and everything matches on each side. And Hagia Sophia is full of these. They're on the kind of level where you would expect to find icons, and of course, one way in which they're interpreted is by saying that, well, you know, icons weren't really there in the 6th century, and that this is the non-iconic decoration that was normal before iconoclasm. Not a theory, I believe. I think there's more to it than that. That's just. But these split images, they don't represent anything, but I think they do suggest something. Also in Hagia Sophia, in the conches round the dome, are seraphim, sometimes with faces and sometimes not. But whether with faces or with not, they are very similar to these in that you can draw a line down the middle, and there's a mirror image of each on either side. And I think that it is. Once you see this, you begin to think, well, what is going on? It's not depiction, and it's not decoration either. It's something more serious than that. And I just want to move on to just give you two examples of what might be regarded, and probably perhaps are regarded as icons by their painters, by their authors. One is a Romanian artist called Paul Gerasim, whom I once had the privilege to meet when I was in Bucharest some years ago. And Father Justin of the Stavropolios Church took me to see him. There was an exhibition called Prologos on, and we saw the exhibition and also went to see Paul Gerasim himself in his studio. And he's been working for a long time on figures like this, which he regards in some way as abstract icons. They are abstract insofar as they are not depictions, and sometimes they're completely blank, and it's just there is just a pattern of colour. Sometimes, as in this, there is a designation, but not a depiction. Here, logos and alpha and omega. And I have also seen in Romania icons that are recognisable. Icons, for instance, it was an icon of the Mother of God in that exhibition in the Stavropolios complex, which couldn't have been painted before Picasso. It was quite clearly influenced by him, but I've never been able to. I don't know where it is. I've never been able to come across it again. And I just want to end with something which might seem totally bizarre. How these pictures come in? That's all right. Yes. I came across these once on holiday in Cornwall, and there was an exhibition at St Ives of a chap called Paul Feiler. And these are called, well, I don't know how he pronounces it, Jan icon or Jan icon, I don't know. But the word icon is there. I know nothing at all about the background of Feiler, who I think is dead now, but he lived many years down, not actually as part of the St Ives community, but within sort of walking distance or travelling distance. And he's done hundreds of these things. And there again, in what sense might one call that an icon? I think I could see a way in which this might be a kind of focus for prayer, possibly, but the focus that is not by way of depiction, but by way of composition. Don't know. But I'm not trying. What I'm really trying to do is to just suggest different ways of looking at the way in which some ideas both what you might call theological ideas, the sense of the play of the apophatic and the cataphatic, and also the way in which the icon, which cannot really be conceived of as a depiction in the way that became traditional in Western art from the Renaissance until the end of the 19th century, the way in which these ideas are being fed into in some way, maybe even influenced modernism at the beginning of the 20th century, and possibly are ideas that are still worth looking at now. Thank you for your patience. That's it.